very good morning to everyone. Thank you, Professor Darshan, for the warm welcome and also sharing the beautiful history of NFI that it was being a part of NFI now. It was great to hear that. Um, and also thank you to Animesh and Deepak for building some great points for SDGs. Just an introduction of NFI. I'll do it quickly because most of it has been covered. NFI was actually set up as an Indian philanthropy initiative back in 1992 for the reasons that Professor Sudarshan shared in the beginning. It's an attempt to fundraise, create funds for development work within India through Indian sources. And NFI traditionally works with small civil society organizations who don't have access to mainstream funding. And so we fundraise from the big funders and then we give grants to the smaller organizations. And we work across 7 thematic areas, which are community health, elementary education, local governance, livelihood security, peace and justice, citizens and society, and development journalism. On SDGs, we've been working slightly differently, taking on the lessons learned from MDGs, which was that there was a lack of national coherence with SDGs. So keeping that in mind, we're actually providing financial and technical support to 5 state governments to build implementation frameworks for SDGs. And the expected outcome is that there would be integration of SDGs with state planning, budgeting, and functioning. The states that we work with are Chhattisgarh, Himachal Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh, Kerala, and Karnataka. We've also been able to, as part of our financial and technical support, been able to establish SDG cells within the governments of Chhattisgarh, Himachal Pradesh, and Karnataka. We have technical advisors on board. One is a former Finance and Revenue Secretary of Government of India, Mr. Sumit Bose. The other is Mr. Satyabrata Chakrabarti, who is the former Deputy Director General of Central Statistical Office, who have been working with the officers in these state governments and orienting them on SDGs, on how we can achieve financial integration of SDGs, and on indicators and data sets. We're also working on capacity building, more than just orientation. We're trying to work with SIRDs and ATIs and Academy of Administration in the state governments to see if there could be modules on SDGs that could be included for officials training. So we're supporting civil society initiatives on SDGs, which is basically supporting civil society dialogue on SDGs at the local level, but also extending the discourse of SDGs to the common citizens, to marginalized communities and ordinary citizens. We're also partnering with social media, print media, and radio agencies to take the message of SDGs to the ordinary citizens. NFI actually works very closely with Niti Aayog and Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, RIS, a think tank of MEA, UN in India, and other civil society organizations. Like Deepak mentioned, that we recently organized a national conclave on SDGs in December, which was co-hosted by Niti Aayog, UN in India, and was co-designed by all of the stakeholders involved and the 5 state governments we partner with. We also engage with global advocacy efforts and represent Indian civil society at global platforms, which is why I'm going to represent Indian, not just Indian, but also global civil society review of the Agenda 2030. Just a snapshot of the statistics that I've taken from the UN SDGs 2017 report, which was released by the UN Secretary General. These are basically just some statistics in terms of social security. That at least in India, you may be aware that there are many social security benefits and schemes that have been announced by the government. But even then, if you think about institutionalizing deliveries, even then we're globally losing 303,000 women during pregnancy or childbirth. We're talking about universal primary education. Even then, since 2008, 9% of the children all over the world have been out of school. That figure has not changed. In the preamble, the essence of the development agenda has been that we recognize eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions, which points out to the fact that there has been an attempt to address multidimensional poverty. It stays an attempt because, like we heard Deepak, that a lot of national and cultural contexts were not taken into consideration when we talked about multidimensional poverty. There is inequality within poverty. There is systematic poverty, like Deepak talked about, customary laws that lead to certain groups not being able to come out of poverty. We're talking about ending extreme poverty by 2030, but at the same time, the economic growth model that we're presenting in the development agenda is very heavily industry dependent, and industries traditionally have been responsible for the kind of consumption that they do, also for the exploitation that has happened since the Industrial Revolution began. Then there's also this debate about economic growth versus sustainable development. If we want to end poverty, if we want to tackle the poverty that exists in the world right now, that means we have to exponentially raise our economic growth, which would then in turn harm our planet. So this is a constant cycle of that, and then climate change affects the most vulnerable. So it's a constant cycle that we're stuck in, and SDG seems slightly too hopeful to address that. In the new agenda, there has been talk about engaging multi-stakeholders, not just limiting the agenda to governments, but also taking the agenda forward, introducing the role of civil society, private sector, etc. in that, which essentially means that the agenda is encouraging public-private partnerships. And the biggest one is that the public-private partnerships raise a big concern of transparency, independence, in terms of policy making and monitoring, because if certain industries are funding certain elements of the development agenda, that means that those elements will not be transparently monitored or would be subdued in the monitoring. And then there's also a question of accountability for private partnerships. I'm also recognizing the fact that civil society would also come under private partnerships, and I am actually encouraging that there should be an accountability mechanism for civil society partnerships as well. In follow-up and review, the primary responsibility for follow-up has been dedicated to the national level, which means that this leaves a lot of scope open for all of us to engage with the national and sub-national indicators set, which is what is happening right now. Niti Aayog and Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation are working on creating a national framework of indicators and data sets, and at the same time, the state governments, based on their own capacities, are developing indicator sets. What essentially should happen is that we should be able to identify indicators that actually lead to transparency, accountability, and action. But owing to the capacities of the different kinds of developing economies, of being able to monitor, and owing to the less frequency of data sets, that we're not able to achieve the kind of monitoring that we wanted to, which is, I think, mainly the reason why we still don't have global indicators finalized, we still don't have national indicators finalized, and again, subnational indicators are dependent on the two. There has to be representation of people living in poverty in the national and subnational indicators. People's voices are not reaching these decision makers who are deciding the SDG indicators at the moment. Discrimination monitoring, which is something like Deepak said, that a lot of these cases don't even get recorded. There are actually attempts made to not record any case under the Atrocities Act. It could be registered under assault, it could be registered under attempt to murder, but it would not be registered under Atrocities Act, for the same reason that violence against women is also discouraged. Nobody wants to, no police station would want to say that in our area there is Dalit atrocities or violence against women. So for that reason, because we cannot rely on the government official data sets, there should be some way of conducting surveys on experiences, perceptions, and attitudes. There should be process indicators. It should not just be about the outcomes, that whether so many children have been going to school. At the same time, it should also be about whether the infrastructure is in place, whether the teachers are coming to the classes. Those process indicators actually lead to achieving the quality that SDGs aims at. Civil society participation in the IEEG SDGs process, which is basically the process that is deciding the indicator framework at the global level. Civil society has been participating, but the overall, globally, the feeling is that the indicators suggested by the civil society are not being included in the framework. And civil society participation in national and global follow-up, in national particularly follow-up and review processes, is absolutely absent. So this is just a bit of context for SDGs in India. More than 80% rural and just below 70% urban inhabitants in India continue to be poor. This is where we're saying that we want to end poverty by 2030. And also looking at some statistics, that poverty rates are 14% higher for Adivasis and 9% for Dalits compared to non-scheduled groups. So there is obviously systematic poverty of certain groups. India's commitment to SDGs at the UN Sustainable Development Summit, where SDGs were first adopted, Prime Minister Narendra Modi said that the SDGs mirror India's development agenda. This has been the structure of how SDGs in India have been implemented so far. The initial intergovernmental negotiations on the SDGs were led by Ministry of External Affairs. Once the SDGs were adopted, then the task was given to Niti Aayog to look at implementation and monitoring of SDGs till 2030. Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, as you know, is working on developing indicators and monitoring SDGs in the country. So this is the progress that has already happened in the country. So the 2030 Development Agenda is actually being dovetailed with Niti Aayog's 15-year vision and 7-year, 3-year action plan exercises. They were not introduced to complement SDGs. That's a separate exercise altogether, but they're being dovetailed with those exercises. Niti Aayog has mapped central ministries and programs to each SDG target based on relevance. I will show you in the next slide how that has happened. And more than 15 states have conducted the same exercise. There have been thematic public consultations being organized, but we're not very sure of the impact it's making on the implementation and monitoring frameworks. Niti Aayog is working with MOSPI to finalize indicators and monitoring frameworks. 63 priority indicators have been identified, which would be the ground for comparing states with one another. That those are the indicators that will be uniformly monitored across all. In the Parliament, there has been an initiative by the Speaker of the Parliament, and she has started a group called Speakers Research Initiative, which I think has 9 members as of now, who meet regularly and discuss SDGs. So this is the Niti Aayog mapping that has happened. This is goal 1. The nodal ministry for implementing and monitoring that goal would be rural development. the schemes have been mapped, schemes and related interventions have been mapped that would complement this goal. According to the targets, each department has been identified. These are a lot of departments for one target. So, these are some examples of the work that is happening in the state, some innovative examples that come from the states that NFI is partnering with. Andhra Pradesh has developed a real-time outcome monitoring system. Government of Chhattisgarh has initiated a Naya Raipur declaration that Professor Sudarshan was also part of, which is a letter that the CM of Chhattisgarh sends to CMs of other states. And the most significant was the one on what administrative reforms are required to achieve SDGs by 2030. So that was an innovative discussion that took place in Chhattisgarh. In Himachal Pradesh, as part of the state vision document designing process, they're looking at rationalizing and restructuring ongoing schemes, and even as a next step, they would also look at budget requirements for these rationalized schemes. Government of Karnataka is forming 17 goal committees for each SDG goal, which would be headed by the nodal department and convened by an office of the planning department, and they're also involving academia and civil society in these goal committees. Government of Kerala has constituted a state-level steering committee, which would be responsible for SDGs in the state, and that would be chaired by the Chief Secretary. Work in progress, which is basically the work that still needs to be done in the government administration. When we looked at so many departments for each target, this clearly means that what we essentially need is convergence among departments, and it's not just about one target, but about how each SDG goal and target is interlinked with one another, and that would require convergence among departments, which needs to be mapped and achieved. Quality, accessible, timely, and reliable disaggregated data is still a challenge in the country. Indicators are still being finalized, data sets are still being finalized, the frequency of the data set is still being challenged, so that is something that still needs to be figured out. Financial integration for SDGs. The development agenda is very clear on domestic resource mobilization. So, and considering that the Prime Minister said that SDGs mirrors the development agenda, India's development agenda, so it should be possible to link our national and state budgets with the SDG requirements. But it's already been 2 years. We've had 2 national budgets. State budgets are also coming out for the second year right now. And no financial integration has happened with SDGs. Though government of Himachal Pradesh, which is one of our partner states, has been mentioning for 2 consecutive years that there would be budget allocation for SDGs, and they're committed to achieving SDGs by 2030. Scheme and policy rationalization actualization. Right now, the existing programs have been mapped with relevant targets, but at the same time, no rationalization has happened that whether those schemes are actually leading to achieving of the goals by 2030. And if there needs to be any change, that needs to be implemented. It's already, again, we're in the 3rd year of SDGs. Integration of SDGs at local levels. SDGs need to go to the panchayat level. Niti Aayog actually conducted an exercise of, as part of their 15-year vision document, that they've raised awareness on SDGs in the panchayats and took their recommendations in terms of what should be the priority for different areas. But at the same time, the policy, the decision making at the local level and accountability at the local level needs to integrate with SDG targets. Capacity assessment and development. In terms of the human resource in the national and the subnational administration, we need to do an assessment of where we stand in terms of being able to achieve SDGs. Is our human resource right now well equipped to identify strategies that would lead to achieving of all the goals? If not, then there needs to be development. Citizen awareness on SDGs. This is as part of legal literacy when we're talking about that every citizen should be aware of the national laws. At the same time, they should also be aware of the global frameworks and the rights that are entitled to them through that. and partnerships with civil society. This is something that Niti Aayog, being the nodal agency for SDGs in the country, has been talking about for a long time, but no substantive partnership has happened yet. No inputs have been taken from civil society for the implementation monitoring frameworks. This is a quote by the UN Secretary General saying that implementation has begun, but the clock is ticking. Way forward would be nationalizing the SDGs, decentralization being a very important step in nationalizing the goals. SDGs, actually annual plans and annual budgets need to reflect SDG priorities. Annual plans and annual budgets of the national government and also the state governments need to reflect SDG requirements. Capacity building for SDGs needs to take place. Civil society partnerships for outreach to marginalized communities. If we're saying leave no one behind, if it is really about the last mile, then it's the civil society outreach that the government should tap onto. Civil society partnerships for monitoring and non-traditional data sets. The traditional data sets being the census survey, the NFHS survey, etc. But for the non-traditional data sets that would look at process indicators, that would look at attitude indicators, that would look at behavioral indicators, civil society partnerships should be considered by the government. Accountability frameworks for public and private sectors, including civil society again. Because the development agenda has not even used the word accountability. They've only looked at it as follow-up and review. At least at the national level, that we should develop accountability frameworks for both public and private partnerships, and building ownership for SDGs among citizens. The demand for accountability should really come from the citizens, for which we need to raise awareness. So that is the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very useful. And that sets the stage for, we have time for comments, questions, reactions. The floor is open.
I'd like, before we begin, I want to acknowledge the arrival of Jashvi Sengupta and Meetu. Where'd you go? There you are, over there. And Meetu Sengupta, I wish you would join us at the table here. There should be seats, enough seats for the two of you to join us. And there will be in a panel, the last panel, but I wanted to make sure that we were aware of their presence. And other people too. Okay. And I also have some observations to make that I can make.
So why don't you make it since you stand on the mic?
Well, all right. I thought that was really rich and useful introduction to a critical review of what's been going on and what efforts have been made. A few observations on equality and indigenous peoples that were brought up. It is quite true, as you pointed out, that the government voluntary report was very selective on the goals that they chose, and they did not choose Goal 10. But I want to acknowledge the value of the civil society report that devoted a full 10 pages to analyzing and just to capture the spirit of that I think reflects your principal concern. The civil society report said that gender, caste, disability, and sexual intersectionality has played a crucial role in redefining sociocultural inequalities to economic inequalities, thus making the most marginalized and vulnerable communities constitute a major share of the bottom 40%. So there seems to be a focus both in the analysis and selection of indicators on what the government did not put in its report, and that's obviously a gap that needs to be closed. I think the same thing can be said for your fully justifiable concern with indigenous peoples. The UN Forum on Indigenous Issues has addressed indigenous peoples, and one of their focus areas is the SDGs, and they pointed out that the indicator framework that will measure progress toward the implementation of the goals includes, as I think you alluded to briefly, 2 indicators that refer directly to indigenous peoples. And that at least is to be acknowledged as a progress, and then 2 others that indirectly relate to indigenous peoples. So the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues has focused on the SDGs, as I'm sure you know, but it might be worth mentioning here. And they stated that SDG indicators should be disaggregated where relevant by income, age, sex, race, ethnicity, migratory status, disability, and geographical location, and other characteristics in accordance with the fundamental principles of official statistics. I won't go any farther on that, and I just wanted to make a similar observation on violence against women. That the UN Women has decided to spotlight that issue, and underscoring the importance of the 2 indicators under Goal 5 on achieving gender equality and empower all women and girls. Under Target 5.2 is the elimination of all forms of violence against women and girls in the public and private spheres, including trafficking and sexual and other types of exploitation. And there are 2 indicators presented in that. So I think all of these papers have presented this gap between work that is being done, good intentions on the part of the UN Secretariat, and the gap between what the Secretariat and civil society and organizations like your foundation and so on have been doing, and the process of the high-level political forum, where truth is not always told in power. And I guess that's really what the 3 of you are pointing at. But excuse me for taking the floor first. I'm sure there are much more pertinent things to be said by others. Thank you.
Okay, Praveen?
I'm sorry, I've come in a little bit very late into this conversation, and maybe I missed out a good amount of work before, but I just wanted to make a comment. I mean, the commonplace understanding is that people generally don't know about these sustainable development goals. This came up yesterday as well in a comment by a student. People don't even know what these MDGs are. And yes, I think in a certain sense people don't really give it that term. But on the ground, and this is from an anthropological perspective, I found that actually people know what the sustainable development goals are, and they are aware that they have a right to a certain number of resources. For example, I speak from my work on water privatization. I've realized, over a period of 5 years of research in the slum rehabilitation area, that people know that they have a right to water. But what's actually happening on the ground is that one particular goal is being used against another. Now, the right to access clean and healthy drinking water has been touted as the reason for privatization itself. Meaning that in case we continue to provide free water to the poor, they will be accessing unhygienic, unclean water. But what you see on the ground is a resistance to this kind of privatization, where people actually know what the sustainable development goals are. So I wonder, if you've had these kind of discussions on what people actually know. People are not completely unaware of their own rights. As Vinada says, they use very broadly this notion of rights. And the rights that they generally use, can very, easily be interpreted in terms of the sustainable development goals as well as the millennium development goals. So I just wanted to know if you've kind of engaged on this issue.
Any others? Yes, Michael?
As a human rights lawyer comes from the other side of this, I always find that if you present something like SDGs as sort of an abstract, we'll set out all these goals and everybody's going to keep writing it all down and bureaucrats are all going to be busy at it, that ordinary people, it doesn't mean anything to them. I used to be a lawyer for indigenous people, and their land was taken from them, so we set up projects to recover their land. So that meant something, and they showed up. We were overwhelmed by that. Water rights. They have farms, they need water, and other plantations are taking their water. we set up something on that, and that is a real thing. It's feeding my family, but not some abstract goal that, oh, our goal is in India is that you can feed your family, but that you got water, you got land, if there's available healthcare. So I'm kind of wondering how this huge conversation on goals gets turned into something quite specific. I would expect ordinary folks who trying to feed their families and get water for their farm and stuff aren't going to show up for just a broad discussion, but if there's some specific thing like clean water and there's a way to exercise that right. So that's good because our title is SDG goals and rights. So how do we convert these goals into very specific concrete rights?
So what about our point that there's a clash between goals?
Between
One
these.
goal is favoring privatization, and the other goal is favoring right conceived as access for everyone to
Right.
water and sanitation. Clash.
Right, so that's it. I think we have to focus on that. And if it's if impoverished communities, we have to see whether their voice, they're actually have a way to claim something, not just to show up at a meeting and say, well, we like to drink water as much as you do, but rather that they have a way to turn it into a very concrete claim for their interest. Because my experience was when I was doing this work, is they showed up in droves when I had a land title project to help them recover land that was taken from them. I had water rights projects so that they could, they have these wet crops and they need lots of water. They would actually, there was not a question about showing up. So if something's turned into something that's concrete, I think it works. And then that's a context where there can be, it would be before local government commissions, larger land use, whatever kinds of institutional arrangements there are, people would be present to get things they wanted, and then NGOs would be there with lawyers and so on addressing it. So it could be turned into something specific. Where right now I'm wondering is sort of we get all these goals, and then we'll measure them, but we don't actually have strong mechanisms to achieve them. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so I just wanted to point out a couple of things. Like, I completely understand what the panelists pointed out regarding the prevalence of systematic oppression that has been going on for like time immemorial now. And that these oppressions are of a certain nature, which are so diverse because of the diversity that exists in India per se, that different cultures go through different phases and types of oppressions. And while SDG is something that is understood at an international arena, to implement these at a localized level is definitely like extremely impossible, and therefore a lot of concerns which have been raised of SDG not including certain issues is sort of understandable. But at the same time, I was wondering if, like the UNHCR has a UPR process which ensures that such mechanisms and implementations of the Declaration of Human Rights is taking place or not, if such a mechanism could be set up by the UNDP, could that potentially help to localize and nationalize the goal of SDG, like Karnataka is doing now with the cells that you mentioned, and how the SDG cells in other states are coming up? If there was a proper mechanism in place, could that perhaps deal with the issues that have been raised in the panel?
We'll come back to the panelists' comments, but yes, come forward.
I can project my voice from here. I just have to.
Well, it's being recorded, I think, for the proceedings, so perhaps you just take this table.
This one has the camera thing.
I just have two sort of quick comments. One was to Kaveri, and I think you pointed out rightly, and I think this often gets missed out because, even between, you use the example of water and privatization, but in a sort of a larger place, you have goal 12, which is of responsible consumption and production, which is often seen as antithetical to industrial, industrial growth, which is goal 8. But I think that's where, more sort of ambitious it is, perhaps, to bring that coherence. In your case, the example that you mentioned about water and privatization, I think that's a perversion of the idea. The point is not that. I mean, that's what the discourse needs to point out, that this is not the way it's supposed to be imagined. You are perversing it for one, agenda, or one's own goals. On the other question of fears, I understand where you come from. I work in an organization called Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, where I'm surrounded by lawyers, and we've been involved with Human Rights Council since 2006 when it was established. And this keeps coming up as a question that I think there's a chasm between the human rights community in Geneva versus the development, and that bridge is not being built. But I think if you break down these goals, I mean, the goals are very ambitious, very sort of aspirational, but because ultimately it's a political compact that was hashed over 3 years, and if you look at the goals, they're really watered down. They're not practicable, but you need to and that's where the localization, nationalization of goals and the indicators. So you have global indicators, and then you have national indicators, and national indicators are where you can actually take the idea of the goal and operationalize it through laws. And when the laws come in, then the access to justice and the actionability of it comes out. And I think that's where we are in the moment. We're 1.5 years in, but the UPR process and all is much longer, so we just have to give it more time. I'm just hopeful about it. Thanks.
Excellent.
Yeah, let me join this amazing discussion and congratulate all the papers. John and Deepak mentioned violence, which I admire to hear, because we don't talk much about violence when it comes to SDG, unless we understand violence as deep structural violence, going to the root causes of why it happened. And I'm sure even if we don't see the word violence, by implementing SDG, violence will naturally be reduced, exactly because if we take the structural violence, Johan Galtung approach, poverty in itself, discrimination in itself is a violence. So definitely giving people education and jobs will naturally reduce violence in itself. So violence needs to be tackled in the deep root level, but it also needs to be tackled in the law enforcement level. And I wonder, my question would be, where you are more disappointed by? The lack of law enforcement dealing with violence? I see a lot of numbers that actually crimes are reported and investigated and dealt with, or are you more unhappy with the way prevention of violence is dealt with?
Right, I'll just invite all of you to respond to the comments. It is of course an existential dilemma for human beings that not all good things go together. For instance, the Supreme Court, which has been very creative in reading into the Article 21 of our Constitution on the right to life, various other rights. One of the early ones was the right to a livelihood. This was in the case of pavement dwellers being evicted from where they resided in Mumbai, and the court held that they should be relocated in places near where they were earning their livelihood, and you couldn't take them outside the city and put them away somewhere else. So that's it made that decision. But then there were all these environment cases, and there was enormous concern about pollution in Delhi, and the court sort of decrees that all industrial establishments in the vicinity of Delhi should be closed down because they cause pollution. But if you implement that directive, then a whole lot of people who are employed by these industries lost their livelihood overnight. So then what happens to the right to livelihood? You can say the right to a clean air and environment is a fundamental right, and then you're doing it at the cost of what has previously been proclaimed by the court as a fundamental right to a livelihood. So these are, dilemmas that can only be kind of sorted out, or even identified at that level of, where the shoe pinches. It's difficult to imagine them at a very general, abstract level when you formulate the goals, but it's only when you come to implementing them that you see what you get up against. That's just a real problem, which Kaveri highlighted. And then we've also had a very fundamental issue about these about the tension between sort of developmentalizing the agenda as a whole and losing sight of a very important advance which the human rights community has made as well. So we've had a very rich discussion. I'd just like three of you to take a minute or two each to react to comments, and we'll end the session.
Thank you for enriching the discussion further. So in terms of engaging with citizens and SDGs, you're quite right that a lot of the work that we've traditionally been doing as civil society or as academia has been around the same issues that the SDGs reflect. And at the same time, there are certain communities that we have been able to reach out to, and there are certain communities that we have not been able to reach out to. Communities are definitely aware about some of their rights depending on the priority areas of a certain region. But it's also looking at SDGs as a tool for advocacy. Telling the community that you know that the rights that you've identified is absolutely right, and you know what safeguards it? SDGs that the government of India signed on to. So that would be a helpful exercise. It would be good to interconnect SDGs with the existing issues at the local level. In terms of a way to turn SDGs into a concrete claim, which is why we're working with the government, and that has been actually that's been a positive development from the era of MDGs, because MDGs was completely disconnected with the national development frameworks and reporting. It was a completely separate exercise. So that way, the integration work that is happening at the national and subnational level right now is what is going to eventually develop a framework for the citizens to claim their rights that they would be aware of SDGs. That is the hope. That is the direction that the state governments are going towards. They are creating mechanisms, they are engaging with the gram panchayats at the local level, they are capacitating the gram panchayats on SDGs, hoping that the accountability mechanisms would also take that forward. But at the same time, we've taken a lot of time in building these frameworks, and they have not been implemented. We have not learned lessons from them yet. They have not been perfected yet, and we're quite 2 years down the line in the SDGs timeline. So, I mean, whether that would lead to achieving SDGs by 2030 or not, that is a different question. But that is certainly the direction that the government is taking right now. Also, your question about the UPR, it's actually quite pertinent, because that should have been the accountability framework for the SDGs as well, the peer review sort of mechanism, the rapporteuring mechanism that happens for the UPR process. That should have been the process for SDGs, but it's voluntary national reviews, right? And with voluntary comes a lot of scope for not representing the reports well, which is what happened in the 2017 HLPF, and Government of India submitted a report. The follow-up and review section of Agenda 2030 says that the peer review, that the kind of review that would happen at the regional level, global level, would be to learn from one another. The Government of India Vienna report had no section on challenges, had no section on lessons learned. It was just about Deen Dayal Upadhyay Yojana, So that leaves us to quite a lot of ambiguity, but at the same time gives us a scope to strengthen our national accountability frameworks, and it gives us a way forward on that. So, thank you.
I come to your question first. Obviously, we want what is our aim is towards prevention of violence. That is the ultimate aim. Yeah. But how to prevent violence is like prevention of violence in India is such a India itself is such a diverse nation, and with so many, like Animesh just said, almost 16 most marginalized or most vulnerable groups there, it's very hard for prevention of violence itself. Because there are various forms of violence against these things. It's not just physical, sexual, or this kind of violence. There are various kinds of violence, and these legal protection or the policies are very much necessary towards achieving that. That is the gist that we are looking at. Yeah, you said about UPR, but the HLPF 2019, which I just want to say that might be a turning of heads, because it will be the completion of first sessions of HLPF, and so it might change, and we hope that it change, that this time it's just governments just comes and say what they are doing and how great they are. Even like last year Brazil just introduced 12-hour working policy for women. That's atrocious. And then they came in and said that they have done this, they have done that, they have protection of women and all those things. India didn't allow any civil society to speak after their submission. That was the only country which didn't allow any civil society or major stakeholder to speak. So we hope that it changes, it goes towards like what UPR does, and hopefully that will be a good thing. But current format of HLPF is really bad, and it is followed by even the regional UN mechanisms, like every region has their own pre-HLPF sessions, which even there they comes and reviews their national progress actually. So even there, the same format is followed. We hope that it changes, and even nationally, if there is a format like HLPF or a format like UPR happens, it will be better for the country itself. And you talked about the engaging of communities, or how to translate the goals and into rights. It's very tricky because everyone has their own priorities. Like for an indigenous group, it might be it might be about local knowledge or indigenous knowledge or land rights, where Dalit will be more focused on violence and the lack of opportunities for themselves. But the only thing, like Srinanjan said, the only thing we are focusing on right now is to decentralize SDGs to the maximum local level, where I'm not sure how much we were able to. Even Indian government is trying through states. Some of the states like Bihar and Jharkhand is actually having a program which goes to the panchayat level, and which actually they are creating their own indicators within the panchayat. That's something very positive. But how much it will be affected, I'm not sure. I'm very sorry for that. Yeah. Sorry. Thank you very much.
You have a word or just a few points. First of all, thank you for being kind to us and not giving very difficult questions. You know, the first question I ask when I'm on the other side is, are SDGs a legally binding document? So I just share a small secret. Most 4 of us are also somehow connected with the UPR process, and we have been telling initially, if we want SDGs to make successful, it should be not only with UPR structure, but also the World Bank and the whole business should be linked with it. If you achieve this within this milestone, then only you are going to get this incentive. Otherwise, you are getting sanctioned. Means that type of economical deterrence also one can really push SDGs. So that's one. Second thing is that if you see during the inauguration of the SDGs in 2015, what happened was in the acceptance speech, our Prime Minister was there, and if you see the speech over again, you will see that it says that half of it is already been achieved by India. So the 3A, the already achieved attitude will lead us nowhere. That's why. I'm just trying to, the concern of privatization of water, because I've been part of the right to sanitation and campaign groups and all. So this has been, actually it's been misplaced or misused. You know, the corporates have a huge role in achieving the SDGs, but that role becomes, you know, their product. So the corporate now has a role in selling water rather than providing clean water. Okay, and there we also have a political twist to it. Whenever we think of Goal 16, water and sanitation, the second thing we think of is Swachh Bharat, and everything is over. So that's the problem. We don't have answers. We have more questions on those forms, and we really need to engage and come out with solutions, because all our rights, you know, even when we speak of rights, so now rights is equal to subsidies, and subsidy is a bad word because it is not stimuli. You can give crores and lakhs and crores for stimuli to the industry, giving them tax waivers, but you can't give any stimuli or subsidies for gas, for farming land. That's a new attitudinal problem. We need to actually directly engage in that. Another thing was this nationalization of SDGs. Already Radhika told. I just want to tell, you know, when we were forming post 2015 agenda, the demands or aspiration did not come what we see today. The demands were very straightforward and simple. They needed drinking water, they needed seed, they needed fertilizers, they needed protection. Somewhere, from taking it from the grassroots to the international level, we changed the language, we watered down, and we brought back, and we are giving them a very different product. You know, it's like taking wheat from the farmers and coming up with some cornflakes or something which they don't understand what's it is. Okay, so there we really need to walk back. And blunt, but that's the way it is. And in the prevention or the public justice system, I think it should be a mixture of both. But the thin line between there is also the perception of violence. You know, my dad didn't beat me much, but gave me some beating sometimes. Okay, but today the perception is violence. So what is the perception? You know, I am forgetting that report. Three or Deepak, anyone can help me out. You know, we had a survey done where the wife says, I can be hit if I don't give warm rotis to my husband. So that's the perception. It's not violence at all. So I think we need to work on the perception of violence. Okay, and then there are other ideological things I think we need to work on, because I don't want, but there are some scriptures telling you can beat this person if this person does this. You know, so one thing we need to work on perception, then we need to work on the prevention, and also because without PJs, justice system, we can't hold communities or corporates or other stakeholders accountable. Thank you.
Thank you very much.